All right. Hello, Danny. How's it going?
Hey, good. How are you, Mike?
Good. I appreciate you coming on and being the second victim for my Health Me podcast.
Yeah, no problem. I think it kind of feels like a rite of passage that like every millennial in their 20s has to go on a podcast at some point. So I'm glad you could be my first here.
Yeah, I
So
think I'm having my quarter life crisis, and this is where we
okay,
this is
good.
where we have arrived so far.
This is a big cry for help.
Big cry for help. Yeah. So if you know anybody, anyway, no, listen, I do appreciate you coming on the podcast today. I think right off the bat, what I really want to do is get to know who you are, because I've known you for such a long time, and I don't know as much about what you're researching now. So we'll get into that. But really, what I want to highlight is basically who you are, and then also stuff you're researching and your background. And then I think today people can get a lot out of what. What you know essentially, because you're basically almost like an expert on a lot of questions what people may have in regards to COVID, and also things in regards to how vaccines are made, and the nitty gritty stuff that people may usually will find confusing for the most part.
Yeah, sure thing. I'll do my best to answer whatever questions you have and stuff like that.
Sure. So let's just say what's your background? Where do you go to school, and
Yeah,
what are you doing?
so my name is Dan Bollen. I'm a PhD candidate. I am in the biology program at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So I'm living here in Boston, and I currently work in the infectious diseases division at Boston Children's Hospital. And so I'm working there as a researcher, and yeah, I guess that's my professional situation right now.
Sure. And
So
then
don't have
you
a PhD yet, but hopefully within the next couple of years, yeah.
cool. And you didn't start off at MIT, right?
As far as sorry,
Like undergrad?
yeah. So sorry. So my graduate work is it was at MIT, but I went to undergrad at the University of Albany, so SUNY Albany in Albany, New York.
Nice. So what made you kind of lead out to MIT?
Yeah, I mean, I guess definitely in undergrad, I sort of realized that I was very interested in doing biological research as a career, and so I applied to PhD programs mostly in the Northeast, and MIT was just sort of the school that I was I went for an interview there, and really liked it. People were I guess it's kind of weird to say, but people were like normal, I guess, like, I guess you kind of expect some people, maybe I had preconceived notions that people were going to be like super, super nerdy or something like that, but everyone was cool. And all the professors I spoke to at the time were just very, obviously super smart, and were just very like genuinely interested in like the things that I've been working on in undergrad and stuff like that. And that was a great feeling. So that's kind of why I decided to stick with MIT. And yeah, as far as like where I want to go from here, I'm not so sure if I want to go into like academia to become a professor or anything like that, but I'm really, I guess, passionate about like scientific communication and teaching, and things like that. So and also just doing research from like a hands-on standpoint as well.
You're just constantly spending time looking at research, or
Uh, yeah, as far as I guess that's part of the gig, is like if you are doing research, you're sort of supposed to keep at least a little bit of your time trained on what else is going on in like the world of the field you work in, and stuff like that. So you're kind of in it, and reading papers as they come out and stuff like that. So I definitely have some that's definitely part of my daily life. And so, but like as far as what I want to do after this, it may not be a hands-on research role, and it may be something maybe more like I'm interested in like scientific writing, where like writing for essentially doing what I guess I sort of plan to do here is interpreting a primary scientific literature for like a general audience sort of thing, is one of my interests. So
cool. So, well, let's get into what you are studying right now, and maybe perhaps what kind of made you so interested in what you're studying.
yeah, so it's always a little strange. So I work in a like, I guess you'd call it's called like a basic research or a foundational research lab. So it's not like my lab. The lab I work in is working directly, like immediately, on things like therapies or anything like that are going to be produced for human use like immediately. It's more just looking into um, the sort of framework of how biology works in general, and so that's the type of lab. And the lab, like I said, I work in the infectious diseases department or division at Boston Children's Hospital, and what our lab studies is I actually work with these small nematode worms, and essentially look at how these worms interact with pathogens. Like, so they eat bacteria, and some of the bacteria that they eat are pathogenic and bad for them and make them sick. And looking at how they respond at a molecular level to these pathogens, but also at a behavioral level, and what are the molecular factors that go into influencing that behavior. So that is sort of, so essentially you have these really, really simple animal systems that we're looking at that are, we can get information from about, like, well, how do, any of the, and a lot of these things in, like, a lot of the genes and things like that these worms have essentially are conserved, up to mammals and stuff. And so they sort of have, like, so learning about worms by studying learning about these genes by studying these super, super simple worms can have implications for what might be going on in things like mammals, for example. And so that's basically it. So I work in the infectious disease division, but like in a sort of, like I said, this basic research way. So when the pandemic happened, people would, people would see that I worked in the infectious disease division, and they were like, oh, like, you must be really busy, or you must be like, and it's like, really, I mean, I'm no less or more affected by the pandemic than anyone else. Like, it's not like our whole lab pivoted to, work on COVID or anything like that, because our lab just wasn't outfitted for that, in the first place. So
Right.
it would be kind of hard to make that big change to, like, immediately study something that, like, directly impacts humans.
Right. Well, you've been working hard. Now you have to work 20 times harder because COVID.
Yeah. So it hasn't been that necessarily, but, just like anyone else, one thing that is interesting is that it is actually, like, we use a lot of the same reagents and supplies as, like, healthcare, like frontline healthcare workers use to do things like these PCR COVID tests and stuff like that. And so we have had, like, supply shortages and stuff, so it actually does affect us in some ways. But yeah, it's kind of interesting. So we'll order something and it's on back order because demand is so high for these supplies nowadays. So it is affected in that way. But yeah, we're still sort of staying the course and looking at this like foundational research level, basically.
Yeah, kind of like a tertiary thing where it's kind of, secondhand kind of helped you or didn't help you.
Right. And the ideas with, like, foundational research is that, like, on one hand, like, sometimes you kind of luck out and there's, like, some foundational research that winds up being, like, super important and applicable. And the other thing is that, and I would say that's, like, a rare case that happens. But then the other case is that it's basically just building up, like I said, like, sort of the framework that, like, actual translational or applicable research is actually, like, built on. So, the people who work on, immediate, like, cures for things and stuff like that are relying upon information that is derived from foundational research all the time.
Right.
And so that's sort of the idea. So you're sort of, like, in the background in a way.
Well, no, you're kind of setting the foundation, and then you're giving people kind of a starting point for other researchers to kind of take that information and then run with it. I'm assuming, is that kind of what you're?
Yeah, exactly. Like, for example, back in, like, the 70s and 80s, when, like, molecular biology was really kind of, becoming a thing, a lot of work was done examining viruses that only affected bacteria, and because they were very simple to use, or very, very simple organisms that you could sort of, or simple systems. I guess there's sort of a debate whether or not viruses actually constitute as being organisms, but essentially they're just super simple and they only affect bacteria, so they're just very easy to work with. And the research that led to the data and the conclusions that were found by doing those experiments are sort of the foundation for, like, how we understand how, like, genes work and how how mutation occurs and things like that. And so that is, so that's the kind of the extreme example where, like, that was, like, very much like something that no one really thinks about nowadays. But like, the findings of that are, kind of core to everything that molecular biologists do. So
it kind of set the foundation early on. And so, well, why is understanding the gene stuff that they discovered so important to like today's research?
I mean, it's almost so important that it's like you kind of become blind to it after a while. But, like, everything that we know about, I don't know, like how genes work, how and I mean, we can get into that when we talk about how like viruses work and stuff. I'm sure we'll talk about. But like just all of that stuff is, if you're doing any research nowadays, for example, let me think on, some sort of, let's see, like if you're trying to treat some sort of, I mean, I guess the one example is infectious disease. If you have like, something that you're trying to learn more about like bacteria or viruses and stuff like that, you can learn, you kind of come into it already with this understanding about like how viruses or, pathogenic bacteria work based on all the things that you learned, that other people have learned about viruses and bacteria in the past. Or if you're wondering about like how, people may have like hereditary diseases and stuff like that. If you're wondering about like what are the molecular mechanisms about how those work, you're working with this foundation of how genes are like regulated, how DNA replicates, how these things are passed down from one person to their offspring, and and so all this stuff is just sort of, I don't know, it informs everything that you do.
Well, it's just important because, genes kind of make up who we are as humans, right? Like they're our genetic material, and give us basically whatever expresses basically is what we are, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. You're so understanding how genes are organized, how they're read, how they are, how they may be changed through mutation over time and stuff like that across generations, how they affect, how your body functions, is all sort of based on these same principles. Like, and that's the thing that is sort of important, is like the same DNA that affects that bacteria have, more or less, is the same DNA that you have in terms of how the DNA actually operates at like a physical level, like how, how they are expressed and stuff like that by proteins. A lot of that is conserved between, microbes to humans, at a very basic level.
And you said hereditary genes, and you had said you work at the Children's Hospital. Are you dealing with mostly like hereditary type diseases and stuff like that, or what are you kind of seeing?
So I like technically I work in like a research building at the Children's Hospital. Like it's part of the this big, they have like a big campus and stuff at a bunch of different buildings. My boss does like work with, so we're in the infectious diseases department. So I'm sure I'm sure there's other doctors on other floors in my research building that do examine the biology of like heritable diseases or like inborn genetic illnesses. But we like my boss is a infectious diseases doctor, and so he's working with children, but about like about infectious diseases that children get and stuff like that, where it is a pathogenic invader essentially that is causing you to have some sort of disease as opposed to anything that you're born with. But yeah, I mean, that is a big thing that affects, I guess I'm sure that is like a major focus of the hospital, but I am actually very much like, I would say, removed from any, like people talk to me about people like ask me about like, oh, like how do I get to this place in the hospital? And it's like, I don't really actually step foot in the hospital much, if at all, because I'm working this separate research building that is sort of a very different environment. Yeah. So
are you just more involved with most of for like the pathogens? Are you just dealing with one in particular, or just like the multitude and the reactions?
Yeah, it's one in particular because, sorry, I shouldn't have cut you off. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I know there's so many different pathogens, obviously, and there's so many things that we don't know about various diseases and different processes with viruses or microbes or whatever. Are you guys really just more focused on the foundations of how those interactions work? Or are you kind of just like, I'm thinking of it as like you're taking this disease. Okay. I'm trying to think of it like there's like a vial, like if you're watching Jurassic Park and they have like a vial of like dino DNA of a certain kind, and they like attach it to, maybe you can kind of enlighten me about that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess so. Like I was saying, so my research specifically is looking at how animals, like the molecular mechanisms behind how an animal responds to being sick, basically. And so what I'm doing is these principles probably apply to just about any animal that can get sick. But the way we do it is, and this happens a lot, you're using like a model system, essentially, is what it's called, where you have, it's like, yes, like, for example, you may be studying, other people may be studying diseases that affect humans, but you can't experiment on humans for good reason. But you can work with mice, which, mice are, you can fit a lot of mice in one room. You can, you can, there are like obviously like ethical and humane concerns and stuff like that. But mice are much easier to work with because of like shorter lifespans. They you can get, they reproduce quite, you can get 1 billion of them pretty easily. And so you're using mice and you're using that to sort of model what is going on in humans. And so we are looking at very, very ancient sort of biology that is conserved between humans and even these worms, which, are, obviously very, very distantly evolutionarily related. And so what we're looking at basically is just using these worms as an example to look at this process. And so we look at these nematode worms, C. elegans is what they're called, which is like the scientific name for it. And then we're looking at, we study Pseudomonas aeruginosa, which is a pathogen that can affect, it's a bacteria that can infect humans, usually in immunocompromised people. So we look at that interaction just because it is like sort of just an easy to study example of how one bacteria affects one animal. And then the biology, the molecular mechanisms that go on in that interaction are applicable to other stuff, but it's just a very, very easy system to work with. That's all. Sure. So it's like we're studying this. I'm studying, and the thing is, there's so many questions to ask about so many different organisms and so many things that we have a lab that's basically focused on this one thing. But there's a million other bacteria you could look at and all sorts of stuff. But yeah, that's mostly what we do.
Okay. So well, then let's get to the main question. Let's think about, I'm thinking every time you're talking about the different diseases, and I'm thinking of COVID, right? And then also kind of, 2020 has been the year where we've all kind of become almost like mini kind of research experts trying to figure out what is COVID? How does it transmit? What does it do essentially? And I think even the experts still have their heads kind of scratched. I mean, we have a general sense for the main idea of what it does, but, maybe do you possibly know, we can just explain perhaps maybe more what COVID is and also how it transmits and how it reacts with microbes and stuff.
Yeah. So I guess maybe the first thing is maybe just like, what is a virus? Cause I think, people sort of think of, people like, oh yeah, viruses, they're germs, they make people sick, yada, yada, yada. But I think a lot of people don't really understand exactly what is actually going on with a virus. And so, and COVID is, it's interesting because COVID is special in that it has impacted like all of our lives in such a dramatic way. But in the grand scheme of like viruses, it is pretty, it's like another virus sort of. But anyway, so the way viruses work essentially is viruses can't replicate on their own. And what they do is they enter a host's cells and then they sort of hijack that cell so that that cell will make copies of the virus. And then once there's a bunch of copies of that virus in that cell, they sort of burst out and then those copies can now infect other cells. And that's how viruses work. And so COVID basically does that. And there's a couple things that are maybe make it slightly different than other viruses. But essentially the way COVID sort of makes you sick is it goes into your system. It interacts. There's these like spike. I'm sure a lot of people have seen pictures of like illustrations of what COVID sort of like should look like. And you see it has these like spike proteins on the outer shell of it, essentially on the outer membrane. And these spike proteins interact with receptors that tissues in your body have, specifically like your nasopharyngeal passages and your lungs have these receptors. Those spike proteins interact with those receptors, and then the virus enters those cells, and then they hijack those cells. So whatever those cells should be doing, now their job is to make more COVID. And it's almost like as far as I know, the virus doesn't actually like it doesn't get into your cells, and it doesn't like make toxins or anything that actually like kill your cells directly or something like that. The reason it makes you sick is because instead of those cells doing what they should be doing, they're now making virus. And just the byproduct of that is all of the symptoms that COVID winds up giving you essentially.
Sure. And now one of the things too that we've seen is that the virus doesn't necessarily, like if you come into contact with somebody who has COVID, you don't immediately, like you go get tested the next day, you may not necessarily, show
Right.
symptoms, but not even test positive. So maybe do viruses typically present themselves in ways like that where there's a latency period, or is this something that's kind of brand new?
Right. So that is typical of some viruses, definitely, and it's different for all of them, and there's just as many different types of viruses as there are anything else, basically. But yeah, and it sort of makes sense maybe if you think about it, like what exactly is happening in that the way you get COVID, like I said, is like some of it enters your system where these receptors exist on your cells, and then the COVID enters those cells and starts replicating. Excuse me. And what's happening essentially is let's say you get infected and like one COVID virus particle, which like this is not usually how it happens. Usually you get like a bunch of them at once that enter your system. But let's say one of them enters your system and infects one cell. If you get tested, one cell out of all the millions of cells that are even more than that cells that make up your body isn't like it's just a drop in the bucket, so it's not going to register essentially. But then as the days go by, that cell is going to produce more COVID molecules, which then affect other cells, and that's why over time you then you gain your viral load increases, essentially is what it's called. And yeah, as your viral load increases, then it becomes detectable. And then you can, and once your viral load increases, that's when more and more cells are affected, and that's when you start getting the symptoms as well. And so I think it makes sense that like based on what is happening, that's why you sort of get this latency period where you technically have been infected, you're not experiencing symptoms because it's not like this total takeover yet, essentially, by the virus. And you don't test positive because the test is not sensitive enough, which I don't think a test could even exist. Like, it's not like a matter that our tests are bad or something like that.
Sure.
It's just like the test, I don't think a test could even exist that would be sensitive enough to detect it necessarily at that early level. But then once more and more viruses appear, then it becomes detectable.
Is there like a line that they say, okay, now because you have X amount of virus, now you have COVID, or do you know what?
Yeah,
like,
so
what...
I guess that's it. Yeah, I guess that's the thing in that like there isn't necessarily a line. I guess it's like if you, yeah, and that's the other question too, is that line also is like affects like transmissibility and stuff like that. Also, like so as your viral load increases, you're actually you can actually like at a certain point you become probably more and more infectious. But then once your body starts to get things under control, your infectivity would decrease. But as far as like if you have COVID, and that's the other thing too that kind of is interesting, the virus is SARS-CoV-2, and then COVID is like the disease that it gives you essentially. So I guess there is a difference between like you are infected with the virus and you are experiencing like COVID-19, I guess, essentially. And so sometimes you're technically experiencing COVID-19 because the virus has sort of occupied your system, but then it doesn't actually manifest as many as many symptoms essentially. So
Interesting. So I guess the question is, do you know how the testing kind of works in regards? Do they like blow up how much? Do they kind of like extrapolate how much virus you actually have to see if like you have COVID in your system, and that's how they determine positive or negativity? Or you're not really sure how that works?
yeah, so I think I don't think it is a question of how much. Essentially, I think it's like if they detect it, it's like you have it. Essentially, like there's a threshold for like once you have a certain amount in your system, it can be detected,
Mm-hmm.
and then but like beyond that, I think the test is binary. Is to my understanding as to how if it's like if we've detected COVID, then it must be at a level where like either it's like one, it hasn't gotten how do I say this? It's like it's either you're going to have more COVID in your system at some point, probably if we can detect it, or you're on the downswing and you have had enough COVID in your system where we can detect it, and that means that you are like infectious. And so how the test actually works is they take the sample, like I'm sure a lot of people have gotten COVID tests right now, but they swab your nasal passage, and then they take that sample and they do a PCR test. And PCR stands for polymerase chain reaction. And essentially what you're doing is you essentially use DNA probes that look for the COVID sequence and then amplify it. And then essentially if the probes you use can find the sequence and amplify it, then you can essentially like detect if you had like any amount of it at all. And like the amplification, the reason you have to amplify it is because that allows like it to be detectable essentially to whatever, human, like the human end of the test essentially. So once the probes can detect that some COVID is there, and they're managed to amplify it such that like humans can now like see it, then that means that you have COVID essentially.
Now, is this new as of recently with COVID, or has this always been something like the technology that's always been around?
It's always been around. I'm not sure. Like, I guess I can't say for certain as far as like I guess like I'm not sure if this is how like all tests work. For example, if you get like a strep test, I'm guessing maybe like a similar system is probably what's going on. Although I'm not exactly sure like how maybe there are other tests for other things. But I'd imagine this type of test could work for other stuff, unless you maybe have more sophisticated tests, because this test is sort of you can make this test, a PCR test, detect just about anything, I would say. But there might be more elegant ways to test for stuff that has been like established. Maybe those are like, for whatever reason, like cost effective wise or turnaround time wise, are maybe faster and maybe easier to use. And so maybe those are the norm actually for other diseases. But for COVID, this is sort of, you can get a PCR test to work. And PCR, and this is again sort of going back to that idea of foundational research, is like PCR is a process that we use in the laboratory for all the time, and it was was sort of discovered and sort of became this application, and now is sort of just completely ubiquitous as far as like being involved in research and in human diagnostic tests. So
Sure. And is that why? So we've been talking about viral load and everything. Is that kind of why we see false negatives, where maybe perhaps somebody who's been infected with COVID hasn't had enough viral spreading, and that's why when they did the PCR test, it didn't show up on the testing?
Yeah, or sometimes there's just, for whatever reason, like for some, sometimes for whatever reason, there's just like maybe the swab, like maybe there is some COVID in your system, but yeah, the swab didn't pick up enough, or like when you transfer the swab to like the tube that you do where you're doing the PCR reaction. If any of those steps, if for whatever reason you don't get like COVID, RNA is technically, COVID doesn't have DNA, it has RNA. If you get that RNA if you fail to get the RNA into the tube, or if like the probes for whatever reason don't pick up that much because like by those steps, like you've sort of lost some of that RNA, then yeah, that would be probably why I would guess a false negative would happen.
Fascinating.
For false positives are sort of, I'm not sure why false positives might happen, but I think the false positive rate, I'm not up to date on like what the typical like false negative versus false positive rates are for things. But false positive could be because there might be something where the probes accidentally pick up something that isn't COVID, but then once you have the probes have picked up something, this amplification, this chain reaction happens, and then you wind up getting something that could appear as a false positive.
Well, COVID is nothing new, right? It's more of COVID's always been around. It's just like the SARS or COVID-19 is the new,
right? Yeah,
is like the new thing that's making it different than everything else that we've ever experienced.
Yeah, essentially, like like I said, the name of the virus is SARS-CoV-2. So it's number 2. it's the sequel to SARS-CoV. I guess
you guys are geniuses over there with the names.
Well, yeah, I guess it's funny too. Like COVID-19 is like, well, it's 2019 when this started, in China and stuff. So it's like, well, it's 19. That's 19. And I guess it's yeah, I guess it's informative. But yeah, so. Yeah, so that's the thing, and that's one thing I guess I don't know if you want to talk about vaccine development and stuff like that. People have talked about the I just don't want to jump ahead of myself, but the speed at which we developed this vaccine. A lot of this stuff like it's related to this like the coronavirus family and like diseases like MERS and SARS, and a lot of the work that was done with those has helped inform the development of the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine.
Yeah, I think it's a good time to talk about it because you said that COVID was it's not DNA but it's RNA, and maybe we can kind of talk about what that is just for clarification.
Yeah. So like I said, SARS-CoV-2 is an RNA virus. So essentially, humans have DNA. Most, actually, I guess all cellular organisms have a genome, which a genome refers to like the set of genes in your body that is made up of DNA. But there are viruses some viruses do have DNA genomes, but some viruses have RNA genomes. And RNA is very similar to DNA, almost exactly the same, except RNA is less stable typically, and is essentially, yeah, I guess there's a couple other things that are sort of edge cases that I feel like are maybe not worth getting into, but that's one of the things is like RNA is less stable. And for whatever reason, there's some viruses that have an RNA genome. And RNA does exist in humans. The way your body does anything is essentially you have your DNA genome, which you can think of as like a set of like the original set of blueprints for anything that's going to go on in your cells. And then your body will make RNA that is essentially a copy of the DNA. It's transcribed from DNA into RNA. And this RNA codes for the same exact information that the DNA codes for, more or less. And then what happens is then your body takes this RNA and then reads the RNA and translates what the RNA says into protein. And the proteins that are in your cells are essentially how your body does anything. And that is what is essentially happening as far as, so that's what your body does. And so RNA does exist normally in human bodies. And the reason this sort of, I guess there's a couple different reasons for why, but one reason you can think of is, for example, you can take one gene from your DNA, make a bunch of different RNA copies of it, and then each of those RNA copies can be translated at the same time, and you get this like amplification effect essentially. And that's the one reason why your body uses RNA. So SARS-CoV-2 is an RNA virus, and really the reason that matters is just because it is essentially less stable, which means mutations can happen more frequently. There are other RNA viruses that people are familiar with. Influenza is another RNA virus. And so in these RNA viruses, mutations happen more frequently. And that's sort of one of the major things that happen. And it affects certain things about the mechanisms of how like it actually infects your cells and stuff like that. But yeah.
So DNA, mRNA creates these proteins, and proteins are what carry out processes in our body.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, okay. How your body, like if you can name anything a cell does, proteins do it for the most part.
Perfect.
And yeah, so that's how that works.
Okay, and then so let's get started with the vaccine then. So the vaccine is an mRNA vaccine essentially. Why don't you kind of describe what that means essentially and why it's different than maybe other vaccines that we've seen in the past?
Yeah, so mRNA vaccines are a pretty recent development. With their, like, I think, papers really sort of talking about the real like use of these mRNA vaccines were kind of increased a lot over the past maybe like 5 years or so. And so what essentially, when you get a normal vaccine, so I guess we can go to like what a vaccine is first. So vaccines are essentially normally when you get sick, if you get sick with COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2 invades your cells. And then after a while, once SARS-CoV-2 kind of has a field day for a little bit, and then your body starts to respond. And essentially what it does is it breaks down and kills the virus when it encounters it. And when it does this, it takes bits of this virus and sort of learns what they look like, more or less. And then once your body recognizes what SARS-CoV-2 looks like, it gets much, much more effective at killing it. And realizing what's going on when it's infected and stuff like that, and sort of prepares your body. And that process is what we call immunity.
That's a natural process that will naturally happen in your body.
Right. That's what naturally happens. And that's why when you get sick with something, usually you become immune to it. And that happens. And so what a vaccine does is essentially is exposing you to those virus parts and teaches your body to become immune to it without you ever actually having to get sick with the virus or the bacteria or whatever you're getting immunized against. And that's another thing I want to point out is that, like, some people I think that, so originally, like, and this does happen occasionally, but like a lot of vaccines used to be like actual whole viruses that are like killed. And there was like there's some people who worry that, if I'm injected with that, can't I just get sick with that virus if it's not like completely killed, for example. This is something you don't usually have to worry about with more modern day vaccines, because instead of getting injected with a whole killed virus, you're just getting injected with virus parts. And the virus parts can't do anything because they're not a whole virus. They're just like, just a bit of it. And so those can't do anything to you, but they are sufficient enough to teach your body to look out for those parts and kill them when they see them. And so it doesn't matter if the part is attached to a whole, like one virus or another virus or whatever, if it recognizes that part, it'll kill it. And so when you get vaccinated, you're getting, so like for the flu vaccine, When you get the flu vaccine, you are getting, there's one part of the virus, of the flu virus, that you're getting essentially injected with, and it teaches your body to recognize that part of the virus and kill it when it sees it. And so now that brings us to how an mRNA vaccine would work. The way an mRNA vaccine would work is, instead of injecting you with protein, which is like the the outside parts of these viruses use proteins just like anything else does. Instead of injecting you with protein, the mRNA vaccine, they inject you with mRNA. And the mRNA, just like how your body is used to turning mRNA into protein, will read this mRNA and translate it into protein. But the protein that gets made is SARS-CoV-2 protein. But this is just like, again, just one protein out of the, I think SARS-CoV-2 encodes for like 16 proteins or something like that. And this is just one of them. It's the spike protein that's on the outside of SARS-CoV-2. And then once your body makes this protein, it's like, whoa, wait, what the hell is this? Like, it's like, it just, it's like you're teaching it to, like, I don't know, build an enemy fighter, jet or something like that. And then once it builds it, it's like, oh, that's what we're looking for. And so then your body basically mounts an immune response against that thing. And so that's what's happening with this mRNA vaccine. And there's a bunch of pros and cons to these mRNA vaccines. But yeah, that's basically how they work. Instead of just injecting you with a protein that your body then like gains immunity against, they inject you with instructions on how to make this protein, and then your body learns how to be immunized against that protein.
So instead of injecting the part that the body creates an immune response against, you're just giving it basically like genetic code to build that small part of the COVID, and then your body creates an immune response and then goes forward.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing I want to emphasize though here is some people might be like, oh, well, injecting my body with genetic code, that sounds kind of risky. mRNA, first of all, is, like I said, it's not very stable. And so when your body is done reading mRNA, essentially, it throws it away. It basically breaks it down. It knows that also, like, mRNA in the system, it's like, okay, well, we read this, and then also just over time, mRNA starts to decay once it's like just been around long enough. And once you start having mRNA that starts decaying, your body definitely is like, well, this stuff is junk, I'm just going to get rid of it. And so there's no issue with some people are worried that, again, like, I think people are hesitant about, I don't want to be injected with genetic material. Who knows what's going to happen? The mRNA will be broken down by your cells after being transcribed enough, essentially.
So your body kind of has an efficiency way of being, okay, I don't use this anymore, let me just get rid of it.
Right. Essentially, that's the thing too, is like, that's what your body naturally does when it makes mRNA, is like your body will transcribe mRNA and it'll read it and stuff like that. But if the mRNA starts to break down, which they just naturally do over time, it's like, wait, I shouldn't be using this because it's like this crappy copy that, like, I don't know if this is actually, complete now anymore because it's starting to break down. So I'm just going to throw it in the wood chipper, basically.
Gotcha. Now you said
that's, yeah.
So, which is great that we automatically know that we're going to get rid of some of this like debris, essentially, that is not important. Yeah. But you did touch upon that you get the protein, or your body gets the mRNA to create the protein, or a section of the protein of SARS-CoV-2. Right. Now I guess there's question around whether the vaccine will help prevent getting COVID. But it sounds like to you, like you're still getting COVID, but it's just like a part of it. And will that allow you to protect yourself from getting it altogether? Or is it you're just like, if you get it, then you can still spread it, but you won't have a bad, like, maybe just explain that difference.
Right. Yeah. So again, you're not, so you're receiving a part of the COVID virus, the SARS-CoV-2. That part is not enough to give you COVID. You don't get anything. You can't catch COVID from this because it's, again, only like 1/16 of the proteins that you would need to be able to make a COVID molecule.
Okay.
And so you can't, you aren't getting injected with anything that could replicate in your body. Or
it's like getting a car tire, but you're not getting the entire car. Like, you're just getting
right.
A car.
Yeah.
Like
yeah.
a tire isn't a car.
Right. Yeah. A tire is not a car. Exactly. So it's like, yeah, you're looking at one car tire. Like, yeah, it's like, I'm trying to think. Yeah. It's like, I'm not sure, if you wanted to like show your friend what a tire looked like, and you were worried like, oh, well, if I give him the whole car, he's going to drive away. So this is a weird scenario, but basically, yeah, it's like, you don't have to worry about them driving away with a car because all you're showing them is a tire.
Okay, yeah, gotcha.
So yeah. So that's the one thing. But then some people might be wondering, well, why do you have side effects? Like, I don't know if I told you this. Sorry. So I don't know if I told you this, but I actually got my COVID vaccine last Wednesday. I don't know. I was very fortunate to get one. And the next day I felt like crap. And sort of I just felt unwell, and I guess I had like some chills, I guess you'd say, and just fatigue. And so the question is like, well, why is this happening to me if I don't have COVID?
Sure.
Like, why does the vaccine make you feel like this? And the reason is because these feelings and these processes are part of your body actually responding. And that's what I think what a lot of people don't understand. Like when you get sick and you feel like junk, I mean, there's some things that are caused by the virus or the bacteria or whatever is happening to you doing stuff to your body. But the other part of it is like when your body is fighting back, it's expending energy. It's expending energy. It when you have a fever, the fever is essentially your body trying to burn out the pathogen, whatever is infecting you and stuff like that. And so same thing with like when you get sick, you experience these symptoms. When you get the vaccine, your body is also building an immunity and is responding to what is essentially harmless, but this response is part of the immunization process. So even though you feel like you're getting something is happened to you, essentially, it is actually part of your body responding and is essentially your body handling it and learning.
So it's actually a good thing. It's almost like indicating that you have a normal, natural immune system to indicate like, hey, there's a foreign entity. My body knows that this is foreign. I need to take care of it and respond in a way that may make you feel like crap, but it's a healthy response to something that's foreign in your body.
Right. And the response you get, like, I didn't feel good for one day, but like, if you had COVID's like knocks you on your ass for like a week from what I've heard.
Right. And you can lose your smell. And I don't want to lose my smell.
Yeah. I mean, some people are asymptomatic and they wind up being fine, but yeah, I know a lot of people who've had it and really just like feel like garbage for days. Or worse, obviously, as we've seen. But yeah, so that's one thing is that the reason you have these feelings aren't because you actually have caught COVID, because because the virus is replicating inside you. It's because your body is responding to something that it recognizes as a foreign threat, essentially. And those processes are your body responding. And this is why also, so both of these vaccines, the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, they say that when you receive the second dose, those symptoms are actually worse. And this is kind of makes sense because once your body has like gotten the first dose, it sort of like learns to recognize COVID, but like hasn't quite like, it has some response. And the second time, now you have this response, this like overwhelming response, because it's like really gotten a good idea of how to like fight this and deal with it. And that's why these symptoms are usually worse the second time.
Interesting.
So yeah. Yeah.
And do both Pfizer and Moderna have 2 shots that they have to take, or is just one?
Yeah. I was thinking about like things to talk about as far as the differences in the vaccine and between the two vaccines. And I guess it's sort of, it's sort of silly to say, but there's kind of like no difference between them. I mean, they're both mRNA vaccines. They both have very similar, like rates of protection. They both are 2 shots. I think the Moderna is like I think the Pfizer one's like 3 weeks apart and the Moderna one's 4 weeks apart. So it's not like huge difference. But yeah, so getting either one, I would recommend.
Sure.
And they're both, fine and safe and stuff like that. Yeah, it is a little weird, I will say, like like I said, I got my vaccine and like seeing on this, they give you like information sheet and they tell you everything that's in there, which is neat. It does say like this is not an FDA approved vaccine, which is sort of like maybe alarming at first, I guess, but like it's like it has an emergency authorization, but it's not technically approved. But like I'm not sure to what extent approval is just like a rubber stamp in some cases, or like just because it had and really the reason it hasn't been approved is because it hasn't been approved yet. Like they're just like it takes a while to get something approved, and they want people to have it now. I'm sure they'll get approved eventually, but yeah, I don't know how long that process usually takes.
Yeah. And even for reference, I mean, like there's supplements, like the supplement industry, a lot of the supplements that you see like in GNC and stuff, that all isn't regulated by the FDA. And none of that is like, even like that stuff, it takes a long time for things to go through like the FDA process to even get like approved to be FDA approval. Like the written, this is safe thing. Not that the vaccine isn't safe, but it has to go through a process in order for it to get that like certification.
Right. Yeah, so I think I'm guessing for the vaccines it's just a matter of time, but yeah, it does take time, and it's like, yeah, just don't have a lot of that. So
right,
yeah, yeah.
And you mentioned pros and cons for the vaccine. Is mostly the cons for the vaccine just that you're going to experience symptoms, or is that kind of something? Are there
Sorry,
other cons?
I guess what I meant for pros and cons, I meant of like an mRNA vaccine as opposed to like a traditional one.
Oh, okay.
And so I think for any vaccine, there's a risk depending on what the vaccine is and stuff like that, that you will have these side effects and stuff. So I don't think those side effects are because it's an mRNA vaccine. I believe a normal vaccine would have those. I mean, certainly for like the allergy, like allergic reactions, that definitely can happen either way. But I mean, like just the sort of expected normal, I think that happens in either case because that's just your body responding immune wise. I guess the pros and cons of the mRNA vaccine versus regular vaccine actually don't affect the people who take them. I think, basically the pros are that mRNA vaccines, like once you know how to make mRNA vaccines, it's like relatively straightforward to make ones for other diseases because mRNA is just like how do I say, like it's like proteins come in all different shapes and sizes and stuff like that, and different like affinities and different things they bind and all sorts of stuff. There's like so many different proteins you can make. mRNA is always like a strand of 4 different bases, which people probably are familiar with the phrase like base pairs in DNA and stuff like that. So mRNA is always a strand of 4 different bases, and like it's fairly easy to make a bunch of different RNA molecules that just are rearrangements of those 4 bases in a different order, and different lengths and stuff like that. So mRNA vaccines, I think, are, and that's, I think, why we have, people say, oh, why do we have a vaccine? It seemed pretty quick that we got this, but I think it's no coincidence that the first vaccines that we got were mRNA vaccines, because once you figure out what you're trying to make mRNA against, the actual like production of the mRNA is relatively straightforward as far as, and so I think that's one pro, is that they're like relatively easy to develop. Like I think it's a relatively quick process, like once you have the technology. Excuse me. And so that's one thing. And then the other, I guess that's probably the best pro, is that just it's like a much faster process that allows you to be able to relatively easily create, like, for example, if God forbid, if we had another pandemic of some other virus, I would also maybe expect that the first vaccines we received for that virus were also mRNA vaccines, maybe with some exceptions, but I would also probably expect that. The cons of an mRNA vaccine are, one, it's this like mRNA, like I said, is not very stable. And that's why you hear like the Pfizer vaccine, for example, has to be kept at like -80 degrees or Celsius or whatever. And has to be very, very cold because mRNA is so unstable. And so that's definitely one of the cons of it. Other cons, yeah, I guess. Oh, and also I guess like expense and stuff like that. Like once you can figure out how to get a protein that works as a vaccine, once you like kind of get that pipeline established for like the actual like, oh, this is how we isolate this protein and package it and all this other stuff, that I guess is a lot cheaper, because making mRNA is straightforward but is typically more expensive. So I'm guessing that, for example, companies that are working on coronavirus or COVID-19 protein-based vaccines, they might sort of take over once they come out, because I'm guessing they'll be easier to transport because they won't have to be kept quite as cold. And then also that they will probably be cheaper to produce and thus cheaper to sell. So yeah.
So how do you see the progress moving forward with the vaccine? Are they going to always stick to mRNA vaccines, or are they hoping to get something different? Is that what they like the ongoing research for it is, or?
Yeah, well, that's the thing too, is like this research is done by, a lot of it's done by companies who are trying to sell the best product there is or whatever, so that they can make money. So Moderna, for example, is like specifically an RNA based company. Like all the stuff they make is like RNA based therapeutics and stuff. So any vaccines they make for the rest of time are going to be RNA based. And they probably have their own niche wheelhouse, like I said, this like faster development, stuff like that they're going to try to do. Other companies probably will, maybe if they have the capability, if they have like the supply chain and stuff like that to make mRNA vaccines, I'm sure they'll try to make them. But then there's other companies who are like, well, we'll let those guys do mRNA vaccines. We've always been doing protein vaccines. We know how to do it. We're good at it. And we have the facilities for it. So I'm sure those people will be making and maybe are making COVID-19 vaccines as we speak. And once those are ready, I think that those will maybe cheaper. And so you might see this two-phase sort of thing. I think what we see for COVID-19 would be what we'd see for other, pandemics. Again, God forbid if they should happen, where mRNA vaccines come out, they're more expensive, but they're the first ones to come out, and then after that you get cheaper alternatives that are these protein-based vaccines, and then those probably take over for the rest of the time, because once this this urgent time element is sort of removed, then you can just use the cheaper option. And so I think for now, sort of the thought is that if we get enough people vaccinated and we get herd immunity, that COVID might become a seasonal sort of illness. And in that case, people will be vaccinated, kids will be, eventually vaccinated whenever they can be and stuff like that. And it'll be, just each generation will be vaccinated for this thing. But I think in the future, those vaccines will probably be these cheaper protein vaccines once they're developed.
Sure. Why don't we explain what herd immunity is too, for those who maybe not know?
Yeah. So herd immunity, I was trying to think of a good analogy for this, I guess. So herd immunity is this idea that once enough people are vaccinated, it becomes much tougher for a disease to spread. And I guess maybe one way of thinking about this is let's say there was another pandemic or something like that. And there was some disease that no one had yet. And let's say I was patient zero for this disease. And my goal or something like that was to get you to be sick. So if that were to happen, I would have to get people sick who got people sick and so on and so forth. And it would have to travel across the country to infect you. And eventually that would probably happen if it was spreading fast enough or whatever. But now imagine the same scenario where I am sick with something and I want to get you sick with something, but everyone else on earth is immune to it. The only way I can get you sick is I have to come to your house and sneeze in your face or whatever. And so
nice to see you.
Yeah. So that's essentially an extreme case of herd immunity. And so if people who you're around are immune, then the people who aren't immune essentially aren't coming into contact with as many people who could or do have the disease. And so that's how herd immunity works, in that I think, usually numbers for herd immunity are 70 to 80% of people need to be immune. Then the people who aren't immune aren't coming into contact that much with people who also aren't immune, and those are the only people who can spread the disease. And so that is sort of how herd immunity works. So once we establish herd immunity, the people who haven't been vaccinated or haven't been exposed to the disease yet won't get sick as much, because they are less likely in general to come into someone who is carrying the disease, because everyone else is immune, basically.
Sure. And
that's how herd immunity works.
Thank you. And I think my devil's advocate brain is working, and it's saying, okay, well, let's say, you want to infect me, right? So if everyone else has had a vaccine and or has had it, the chances of me getting it are low because everyone else can fight it off. So if we're trying to achieve herd immunity, why is it not smart for Americans to try and spread it to other humans of, let's just say, our age, to just be okay, well, if we all get it, then we don't have to worry about it anymore.
Right. And I think this comes to the ideas that, especially early on, was part of the discourse in the pandemic, was flattening the curve. I think is maybe the thing it applies most to, is that, one, you can't quite control exactly who you're giving the disease to. Again, sneezing in someone's face is probably a pretty surefire way to infect someone. But on your way to someone's house to sneeze in their face, you might come into contact with other people who are more at risk and actually should not be getting the disease. They really can't afford to. And then the other thing is that essentially, if the disease starts to spread like wildfire, sort of thing, then hospitals become overwhelmed, and that hospitals can only afford to take care of so many sick people at once. And so that's the problem, is that if you're trying to spread herd immunity through a population by people getting sick, you're gonna get a lot of people sent to the hospital. And if people are sent to the hospital, too many at a time, then the hospital can't take care of these people, and then you wind up with deaths. And so that is sort of, why it doesn't really make sense to try and spread it. And I think people forget the law of large numbers, as far as there's a lot of people, 80% of the United States population is, I don't know, over 250 million people, so it's trying to get that many. And so far, I don't remember how many cases of COVID the US has had. I'm not sure if you know that off the top of your head,
I don't
but it's
know.
like, we're not even close to that number yet. Like, we're not even,
no, there's a lot of
like,
people who have not gotten it.
Right, exactly. And it's like,
Thankfully.
and for all the, deaths that we've had already, like, it doesn't seem like it would be wise to try and get, another 100 million people to get COVID all of a sudden, sort of thing. So that's sort of the issue. And it's much safer to try to get people as vaccinated as quickly as possible, because then you're going to slow the spread. Not just because once someone, and again, sort of this idea is like, every time a person gets vaccinated, they can't get COVID, but also, I guess this isn't technically known yet, but it's likely that they won't be able to spread COVID to other people. And the reason that I guess to maybe preempt a question you might have asked is like, the reason why once you're immune, you probably can't spread COVID is because, again, if the COVID tries to enter your system, that sort of like replication is sort of what leads you to having higher viral loads. And that's what makes you so that once you have a high viral load, you speak or sing or sneeze or whatever, you are spreading virus elsewhere. But if some virus enters your system and your body just shuts it down immediately, then you don't have virus to spread, essentially.
Spread ultimately,
the idea.
yeah. I know for one, I have stopped singing altogether since 2020 has started. So it's been a benefit to the other humans as well as myself that I've stopped singing.
I remember seeing like, someone was like, like, oh, these like, there was in Italy when the pandemic was really bad there, people were like singing on their balconies and stuff like that. And people were like, oh, they should stop singing. And I was like, what are you talking about? And then I like looked it up, and it's like, singing spreads COVID like twice as fast as speaking does. Or so I was like, oh my God. So yeah, I don't know.
Here, screw you, neighbor. I'm going to sing my ass off. And
Right,
I'm going to
right.
give you COVID because you live above me.
Yeah.
So let's get back to you. I think you've alluded to mutations a couple times, and obviously mutations have been something that's been super prevalent as of recently with the UK virus or whatever. I think you mentioned it was kind of a normal process for mutations to happen, but maybe describe why mutations happen, why they're normal, and then we can kind of go from there.
Yeah. So mutations are going to mutate. You know what I mean? So it's going to happen. It's like I said, RNA is pretty unstable, and and this happens with DNA too. Just by when you replicate a piece of RNA, sometimes you make a mistake. Essentially, is what's going on. So every time a new virus particle is made, and this happens in humans, whenever you make a new cell in your body, whenever mitosis happens, whenever you copy it, there's a chance you make a mistake. But then the thing is that once you make a mistake, the virus that's new that has that mistake doesn't have any concept, can't remember what it should be, essentially. So it's just going to carry that mistake until that virus dies, or until it, or if it keeps replicating, then that mistake will get inherited by everything else. So that's what a mutation is basically, is when trying to copy the genetic material, a mistake happens. Now, like 99.999% of the time, the mistake that happens is not good for whatever just got that mistake, essentially. Usually it causes a virus that is worse at replicating, usually, because it's easier to break something than it is to improve upon something, basically. But in the very, very slim, number of times, sometimes that mistake does improve that virus, and suddenly you have a virus. And this is literally like evolution at work, is like, now you have a virus that is different than the other viruses and replicates slightly faster or something like that, than the others. And so it starts replicating more and more and more relative to the others around it. And then that's how you get these variants, essentially, where this one virus happened to pick up a mutation that was beneficial to it, and now is spreading, essentially, and all the copies of it, unless they make mistakes, will have that mutation.
So mutations are meant to happen, and they're a natural part of basically evolution of a virus, so to speak.
Yeah, or anything else, really. And this is like sort of why, I mean, in humans, like, that's why people get cancer, is because as you age and stuff like that, as your cells divide, they make mistakes occasionally, and unfortunately those mistakes can lead to cells replicating too much and stuff like that. And that's how cancer accumulates, essentially, is these process of mistakes. And yeah, like I said, most of the time, and that's the thing, is like I said, the vast majority of times these mistakes are bad for whatever they happen to. But for viruses, like in a single person, there's like billions of individual virus molecules at a time. So, it's just kind of bound to happen, just with so much going on, essentially. Yeah.
Right. And just because a mutation happened doesn't necessarily mean the lethality of that virus has changed, right? Like it may become
Right.
more efficient in spreading, but just because it's more efficient in spreading doesn't necessarily mean it's going to kill you faster or kill you more so than the original virus itself.
Right, right, and there are certain parts of viruses that mutate more quickly than others. Sort of by that same principle, in that like if a part of a virus is like essential for it to function, that part is going to mutate less because it's more unlikely that like any mutations there are going to kill the virus. But like there are other parts of the virus that maybe are less essential, and those can mutate more. And so that's yeah, and so essentially these mutations can cause things like they can change like infectivity, like how likely you are to get infected with the virus if you're exposed to it. They can infect like the replication rate of the virus, or they could infect, potentially lethality that could happen, but they aren't all necessarily connected. There isn't like one mutation that makes the virus better in every way or anything like that. So yeah, yeah, and the other thing is also, yeah, I guess that explains it.
Sure. And let me play devil's advocate a little bit more. So, we've been talking about mRNA vaccines, and of course, the mRNA vaccine, when you give it to somebody, it gives them the code to create the protein and so on and so forth. Is the mRNA vaccine that they're giving them, is it a synthetic mRNA? I guess I feel like people they associate like vaccine with like almost synthetics or something that's like foreign or bad in their body. But is this something that's
Right.
perhaps a natural occurring process that you're giving to people, rather than, because I think, and even like with people who are like against vaccines or maybe are skeptical, they think, oh, well, you're injecting mercury into me or formaldehyde or all these other things too. And maybe perhaps with mRNA, they're thinking the same thing too, where this is a synthetic mRNA.
Yeah, the thing is that so one, these other molecules, like I think if you look at the list of what's in at least the Pfizer vaccine, I haven't seen the list of what's in the Moderna vaccine. I'm guessing they're very, very similar. What's in the Pfizer vaccine is mRNA, which is like the business end of it, obviously. Lipids, and there's a bunch of different lipids that are in there, which are essentially used to help your cells take up the mRNA. And then there's like salt solutions, and I think there's like a little bit of sucrose, so sugar, and that's it. So there's nothing that's like particularly scary sounding. And I guess, I would argue also that some of the stuff that sounds scary isn't actually scary in certain circumstances. And as far as like whether or not synthetic mRNA is actually any different than like regular mRNA, there's really no difference. And I'm not exactly sure like the industrial processes by which the mRNA is actually made in this case, but there's like physically, like if I showed you mRNA that like I took from a human cell and mRNA that was made in a petri dish by bacteria, if the codes are identical, I don't think there's a way you could actually tell at all, like in any like the atoms are exactly the same, so there's no difference as far as that is concerned. Yeah. And I think we were just talking about, mutations, and just speaking of vaccines and stuff like that, I'm sure this is maybe something people are worried about, is like if there's mutations happening in these variants. I know there's like the UK variant, there's like a South Africa variant, and I think Brazil one at this point. Do the vaccines work against those? I'm sure is a question that a lot of people have been thinking about. And the answer is like probably. And sort of the other thing, so one, the way these vaccines work, and I've been sort of like, I guess sparing a lot of the detail as far as how your body is actually killing the virus and how it actually learns to kill them and stuff like that. But it all has to do with how well things interact. And same thing with infectivity, is like the reason why a virus can gain a mutation that makes it more infectious, it is now like whatever mutation it just gained makes its spike protein essentially interact stronger with the receptors on your cells. And so essentially, just in a similar way, the vaccine that you have is now training your body to interact in a similar way to those spike proteins. But even if those spike proteins change slightly, maybe that interaction becomes slightly weaker. But like even a slightly weaker, I think Dr. Fauci called this like the cushion effect, where it's like there is some cushion essentially there, where if the spike protein changes, maybe that interaction between the antibodies your body has made against the spike protein, maybe that interaction is slightly weaker, but still is helpful, definitely. And so maybe it's like slightly less able to like, and maybe it's slightly less effective against that type of COVID, but like is still probably fine unless that spike protein continues to accumulate mutations to which it's like unrecognizable to the vaccine. But I don't think we're there yet at all. And I guess I'm really talking here, but another thing I wanted to say real quick is the one thing that they recommend also is this is actually a reason, these variants is actually a reason why people should get vaccinated. Actually, like if you're worried about these variants, and I'm sure some people maybe think like, why the heck am I going to get vaccinated if it's like useless or whatever. The thing is, one, it still protects you against the original, the OG COVID-19 strain. And the thing is, like, these mutations, like I said, these happen as viruses replicate. And so if more and more people get vaccinated against the virus, then the virus has fewer hosts to replicate in, and thus fewer mutations will be happening. And that's something that is something to keep in mind. And that, like, if the pandemic were more under control, then you would actually see fewer of these variants emerging because fewer viruses are actually like replicating at any given time, essentially.
So because the virus has the opportunity to go to so many hosts, it's starting to learn more, not learn, but essentially figure out or mutate more. And with more mutation means the chances of mutating in a wrong way is going to increase.
Yeah, exactly. And mutation, like I know you sort of tried not to use the word like figure out there, and that is correct in that, like, essentially mutation is completely random, and you can imagine it like, if you're well, I'm trying to think of something maybe more like playing the lottery or something like that. If you have a billion chances to play the lottery, chances are you'll if you got a billion tickets, then you'll probably maybe win. But if you had 1,000 tickets, then your chances obviously go down much more. And this is the same way where by the pandemic infecting so many people, the virus is essentially playing the lottery a lot and, gets lucky every once in a while. But if there were very fewer people infected at a time, then the virus actually would not accumulate mutations as quickly. And that's the other thing too, is like once, not sure how, they say maybe by the end of this year, the pandemic will be more or less under control. Once we get to that point, then we really won't have to worry about mutations in the virus as much anymore, because the number of replications that are happening at any given time by the virus is actually very, very few.
Interesting. So, which is great, because obviously I think we're all ready for this, to be over with at this point. And I think we're all ready to, greet each other out at a bar, or at least like see each other and go.
I was thinking about like movies today. I was like, man, I haven't been to a movie theater. Like, oh man.
I think honestly, I swear to God, I was thinking about like movie popcorn a while ago. I was like, man, I miss that stuff. Like it's just the simple things after a while.
Yeah.
And you mentioned seasonal, and of course that obviously can be a scary word. Meaning, are we going to be going in and out of this? Every year, every 4 years, like what do you mean by seasonal? And is it just something that we're just going to have to live with the rest of our lives? Or you think that after we get things under control, people are vaccinated, perhaps seasonal won't happen? Or is it something that's going to be around for, the next 10, 15 years?
Right. So I guess to answer this really quick, one thing people talk about, and this has been talked about for a while, is like, does the vaccine or does getting COVID actually provide you with long-lasting immunity against SARS-CoV-2?
Yeah.
And that is a question that was asked for a while. And I think one way to just kind of maybe assuage people's fears about that is like, most of the time, like for example, like, most of the time, the answer is probably that like you'll probably be fine for at least a long time. And the question is like, we don't know this for sure because like obviously, like that would take years to find out, and it hasn't been years yet. So we don't know for sure, but I think like to err on the side of like, for most other diseases, you are, immune for the majority of your life after you get it, I think is probably like a pretty safe bet. And so as far as seasonality, once, if we establish a herd immunity, and if let's say 80% of the people are immune to coronavirus, your immunity will probably stick around. Maybe you'll have to get a booster shot at some point in the future, depending on what people figure out for how long the immunity lasts. But yeah, so if you get a vaccine or if you had COVID, you're probably going to be immune. I don't know. I guess I'm not an expert, but like 5 to 10 years, maybe at least, I would say. And so that you wouldn't have to worry about. But for the other people who aren't vaccinated either, I don't know, there are people who, can't get vaccinated for whatever reason. Children, these vaccines aren't approved for people at least under 16, I know. And at least. Or like people who are immunocompromised and stuff like that, those people might have to worry about COVID going forward. But the question is, then will it actually be seasonal or not? And so I was reading a little bit about this, and apparently seasonality, it's not exactly like completely known why seasonality is a thing, for example, for flu virus. And so what they think is just because, one, like people are indoors more when it's cold out. And so that's like, as we see, like, being outdoors, you're less likely to get sick from someone else. Two, like cold, dry air preserves viruses more and dries out like your mucosal layers and stuff like that. Like people get like I know people sometimes get like bloody noses during the winter because like their nasal passages get all dry and stuff like that. And so that actually, because you don't have as much mucus and stuff like that, that actually affects how these infections occur and stuff. And so so basically, like it could be seasonal, essentially, where like maybe COVID will always be a thing going forward, infecting, maybe circulating through these populations of people who aren't vaccinated or immune yet, particularly children. Thankfully, I guess for COVID, children don't seem, the illness isn't that severe. But so it'll be circulating probably through these, and maybe that circulation will get worse during the winter just because, it winds up being slightly more infectious during the winters. So that could be a thing. But for the people who are vaccinated, I don't think you have to worry, basically. And by the time they figure out if you do need a booster shot or not against COVID, you'll be able to get one. So.
Sure. Yeah. And maybe another devil's advocate here for just even for my sake, I understand that, you'd said that the long-term effects are kind of questionable, right? Because it hasn't been that long, so we can't know the long-term effects. What do you say to people who are like, okay, well, I know the vaccine's supposed to help, but this is something new and they still don't know what the long-term implications may be. Maybe perhaps talk about why maybe it's safe and you back it up for that reason, or maybe it's just because we don't know yet and this is the best option as of right now.
Yeah, I would say it's a similar thing to what I was saying before about the it's like we don't know for sure, but I'm sure any scientist who if you told them to bet would bet that it's totally safe for the for the rest of your life. Nothing in, like I said, the mRNA gets degraded. None of these other things that are injected into you are known to have any effect. So it's like this like formulation altogether. Technically, it's never been tested. We don't know what it'll do to you after 10 years, but like everything that's in it shouldn't do anything to you from all we know for 10 years. But it's like technically we don't know for sure. We haven't done like, and that's one thing about science, and that like you do want to test things, like even stuff that seems obvious, maybe you do want to test it to know for sure. But nothing would indicate that anything would actually happen to you in this case. And the pros of getting vaccinated, I would say, far outweigh the chance that anything negative would happen to you down the road.
Right. And we talked about earlier with allergic reactions, and I think Moderna has recently put out the news had put out information about Moderna having allergic reactions. Maybe you can speak on the normalcy of allergic reactions. Are they normal? Is this something we should expect? And, why they happen just so frequently?
Yeah. I don't know that much about like allergies and stuff like that. I mean, I know that, there's certain things in these, in vaccines that they ask you, like if you're allergic to eggs, for example, and stuff like that. And so I think there's like a certain range of people, or like if you have any history of allergies to vaccines, maybe you shouldn't get it. But as far as these other like severe reactions, I'm not sure if there's a way to predict them necessarily, but they are pretty infrequent. I mean, and I think people kind of forget that, like, it's easy to see. I think there was, for example, there's a man in Florida who like got the vaccine and then like he died like 2 weeks later or something.
He was a physician, wasn't he?
Yeah, something like this. So that was like a really crazy case, but like that's still being investigated, first of all. But then also, I don't know what the number is at, but I think we're at like 1 million vaccinations per day at this point. And it's just like the chances of this happening are so astronomically low. And some people do have, I mean, for that especially, but like some people do have other reactions to it allergically. And, you know, they go into, you know, anaphylaxis, and then they have to be treated and stuff like that. But yeah, again, I think it's the minority. I mean, I guess if you have a history of, you know, I mean, if you've gotten the flu vaccine before and you had an allergic reaction to that, maybe talk to your doctor or something like that before you try this or anything. But if you've never had a history of that, if you don't have any reason to suspect that you would have an immune response, like an inappropriate immune response to this, then I think it's probably going to be fine. And again, the people who do actually experience these things, I know, you know, there's been a couple of reports of them, but like are, you know, the vast minority. You know, it's like anything with, you know, like flying on an airplane. It's like, yes, it's bad if something bad should happen, but just like the rate at which it happens is so low that it's probably going to be fine, I would say. Yeah, I'm not sure about like how the rate of allergic reactions for this compares to other vaccines, but I think it's,
well, I'm assuming, well, maybe as far as I know, with vaccines, even in children, like there's some kids who have like allergic reactions, and I'm like you said, with the law of like mass numbers, you're gonna have reactions. With so many humans, you're gonna have so many different human reactions. And if that's the point, that doesn't necessarily, like you said, like if, you know, the chances of going down in a plane are 1 in whatever, you're still gonna more or less you're gonna get in a plane because the chances are relatively low.
Right. And yeah, and again, so I mean, I think, you know, maybe you'll have an alert, but also I guess that, I mean, I may be editorializing a little bit here, but if you have an allergic reaction, I mean, most of the time you wind up being fine, right? Like, I mean, I don't think anyone has died of an allergic reaction to, well, maybe there has been some people, but like, I mean, if you get an allergic reaction, obviously not fun, but like, you know, I don't know, you can get treated for that, and now you're immune to COVID.
I think people really like to look at like, oh, look, see, it's bad. See, you better be careful. You better, you know,
right.
Just how fast information travels so much.
Yeah. And I mean, yeah, I mean, you don't want to, like, yeah, if it was like, hey, want a shot of this, it's going to give you alert. It's going to close over your throat. You're going to have to go get an EpiPen injection or whatever. Like, obviously I would say no to that, but 1, it's probably not going to happen. And 2, if it does happen, you'll probably be okay in the grand scheme of things, I guess, is sort of what I would say. And yeah, and again, the chances of this happening are very, very small. So
sure.
That's kind of what I would say.
Yeah, and we've been talking about almost like the immune response altogether as humans, and basically people's reactions to the vaccine, as well as a natural, like, actually just getting COVID in general. One of the things that I feel like people aren't talking enough about are natural ways to build the immune system. And one of those being obviously exercise. And this is obviously an exercise podcast as well as, you know, a health podcast. So, you know, relating it back to overall health, perhaps maybe you can speak on maybe how COVID maybe affects people who have comorbidities such as diabetes or cardiovascular disease, and why it's so important to be relatively active and maintain a level of health, so that way we can kind of battle these viruses.
Right. I think I think that's certainly one thing where you know, people who have these comorbidities, and some of them, you know, for a lot of people are something that you can sort of control through like diet and exercise and stuff like that. And I think that sort of raises, I'm sure a lot of people have sort of thought of that, and sort of, I mean, especially with quarantine causing a change in a lot of people's lifestyles and stuff, I think that has maybe kind of turned a lot of heads as far as like, oh, maybe I should be taking better care of myself and things like that. As far as why these things happen, or like why comorbidities are comorbidities is, you know, this is one thing that I said, how, you know, you can't do experiments on humans. So a lot of this isn't known. Really what you can do is you can do studies where you follow people for a certain amount of time and see what happens to them. Or you can do like statistical analyses where you are just looking at the data empirically and seeing what comes out of it essentially. And that's sort of how we know about what comorbidities of COVID-19 are, is that like just looking at the data, you see that people who have these things, you know, they're more frequently deaths, and so essentially, yeah. So as far as why these things happen, it's not like completely known. I would say maybe sort of the common sense is probably actually pretty correct in that, for example, I mean, diabetes is one where your body is sort of, I guess it depends on if you have type 1 or type 2 diabetes, but your body is not responding properly to stimuli to processes that are going on in your body. Like insulin is very, very, is critical for how your body functions, even at a cellular level. And especially for type 1 diabetes, who do have, type 1 diabetes is like an immune, an autoimmune disorder, is what is considered. And so these things where the immune system involved, like inflammation is going on and stuff like that. Like people with diabetes are sort of in this like chronic state of inflammation, from what I understand. So that is going to interfere with how cells are able to respond in times of crisis, such as when, pathogenic, microbes are attacking your body. And then same thing with, things like weight and how that affects like lung function and heart health and stuff like that. And just, again, when your body is in crisis, when you're unable to get oxygen into your body and stuff like that, because if your organ systems aren't strong enough to handle the stress that's going on, that's going to lead to issues essentially. And I mean, I think people maybe underestimate how like your heart is beating all the time, dude. I mean, it sounds silly
Really?
to point it out. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's kind of obvious, but
Brand
I think
new
people kind of
information.
forget. Right. Sorry. Yeah. This is the hard hitting science you brought me on for. No,
Yeah.
but I think people kind of forget. It's like, listen, like, yeah, like you're breathing all the time. Your heart is pumping all the time. And so it's like, if your heart is having a harder time pumping, and then suddenly there is this, thing that is affecting your lungs, affecting your breathing. And like, I don't know if you've ever seen like videos of people who have really bad COVID-19 in particular, like where they're really, really struggling to breathe, and because your alveoli are infected and all this other stuff. I think it's no wonder that these stresses compound and sort of lead to, unfortunately, these outcomes. And yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned stress, and I've seen this before, even as a physical therapist and a trainer. One of the biggest things that people talk about, especially like in regards to fitness and health, is inflammation, right? Like you got to decrease your inflammation, you got to get on the
Right.
keto diet, decrease your inflammation. Are you seeing that inflammation or even like stress is a big factor in regards to other diseases that you may be researching, and maybe like transmissibility with other microbes, or perhaps you can talk more about
Yeah.
it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it depends. It depends on the microbe. It depends on what's going on. I think that I think, for example, anything that affects your immune system, anything that affects inflammation, because inflammation is part of like your immune response, for example, and inflammation is just not good. All the responses that are happening at that time are not great for your body in general. And so I think that's one thing. Is it's like I think it's sort of two parts. As far as one part is like your body's ability to like focus its energy and stuff like that into I mean, well, when I say it like that, it sounds sort of pseudosciencey, but like your body is like allocating resources and using things and stuff like that. And I think that's one thing, for example, why like insulin insensitivity, your body can't like respond on a dime like it needs to certain crises that are developing in your body. And then the other part is like stresses on particular organs and things like that if those organs are already not performing at peak, like they might be in someone who is, completely healthy, then when they are stressed, when they are like pushed to their limit, that limit is a lot easier to reach than if it was just, if you were a perfectly healthy person. And so I guess, with as far as it relates to other diseases, there are some diseases that don't affect those organs, for example. And so I think those, I don't know, I'm trying to think of something like cholera, for example. Cholera is a disease that, we don't have to worry about as much in the US, but it's like a diarrheal disease. And you basically like lose a lot of water from your body and stuff like that. And that is like stressful on your body as a whole, but doesn't target those same systems like your lungs or your heart. Like COVID is forcing you to breathe and like pump blood through your body and stuff like that. So I think that is sort of like, so there are other diseases that probably don't have share those comorbidities because they don't affect those systems as much. But I would say other things where if you have a chronic illness like diabetes, where your body is sort of in this state of disarray, I guess, in a way to call it, I think those probably do have similarities. And so I think that as far as like similarities to COVID, I think any respiratory illness, if I were to guess, would have similar comorbidities as COVID does, like, for like, people who have like COPD or something like that, like that respiratory illnesses, COPD is going to be a comorbidity. But if it's not a respiratory illness, then that's probably not a big a deal. But then there are other comorbidities that are sort of overall, affect every system in your body, such as insulin insensitivity, I guess.
So do you, I guess the question maybe I'm trying to ask, do you look at, like, when you look at microbes and you introduce a pathogen or a virus to a bacteria or whatever you maybe happen to be studying, do you happen to see a higher transmissibility in maybe bacteria that are under like a stressed environment versus one that has an ideal environment? Or is it something that's not something that you look at in general, or be something that you don't even notice?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm sure that, that's interesting. I think, so that could be something that, like, potentially actually someone in our lab could look at. That is something that, for example, I studied, like I said, these worms and how pathogens interact with them. And you could, for example, starve these worms or give them food that isn't as well suited to them, or look at mutants that don't have the same cellular machinery in order to respond to these things. And so you could definitely probably look at that. I have not done that. And as far as other diseases, but I would say, so I haven't looked at that. I'm not sure what the literature actually says, but I guess if I were to guess, then I think that would make sense that, like, if you're unable to, like, allocate your resources to change the processes that are going on to properly respond to something that is happening, then you're going to have worse outcomes, I think, overall. And that's the thing, is, like, I'm sure stuff in mice may have been done. But
it just goes to speak on overall the stressors and inflammation, other things in our life can affect basically our immune system. And I think we can't forget that, and stress the importance of obviously maintaining a healthy lifestyle and doing the best that you can, regardless of your situation, and trying to maintain overall health. So that way, if you do have to combat a disease, a virus, a pathogen, or whatever, at least your body's working at full efficiency to try and do its best job to fight it off.
I mean, and I guess, I would almost argue, I guess, well, I was gonna say, I mean, pandemics are like once in a lifetime events, hopefully. But, like,
cross our freaking fingers,
like, but other things like, common colds and stuff like that, I think your body will have a lot better time doing this if you are handling those, if you have, your body is in the right shape to combat these. And I think, and I do kind of hope in a way, or think that, like, the pandemic might be a wake up call for a lot of people, in that, like, I think there are a lot of people who, have relatives or something like that who aren't maybe in the best of shape or something like that, or have these things that are commonly sort of considered comorbidities, like, you may have a relative who is like a heavy smoker or something like this. And then, like, now this happens, and now it's really like, okay, like, maybe I knew that wasn't good for you before, but, like, now this is like a really serious, like, it just heightens this sort of notion. So I think a lot of people are maybe realizing this.
Even then, sometimes still people don't change their habits, which is kind of bizarre to me. Isn't that wild?
I guess that's human nature, I guess, I mean, you could probably talk, maybe you'll do this at some point, but just like the psychology of people changing behaviors, I guess, like, so much of, I'm sure what you'll be talking about as you do these episodes is, like, it's all about behavior, or not all about behavior, but, like, a lot of it comes down to behavior. And so it's interesting thinking about the psychology behind, like, why do people act the way they do and stuff like that. And I guess it sort of is regards to the pandemic, not necessarily from a personal health standpoint, but, like, it's also, like, about behavior of, like, getting people to act in the ways that they should in order to help, in the pandemic's case, the health of their community and the people they know. But I think a lot of that applies to the same thing of how people choose to their own personal health, about, like, well, I know this is bad for me, but I mean,
gotta live my life.
I think that's sort of human nature in a way. I mean, that doesn't mean that it isn't something that people should work on, but I think that, and I think that and that's the thing too, is there people have exceptions for everything. There's people who have, everyone's human, and a lot of people who, maybe, like, really, really good about taking care of themselves in certain ways. Maybe in other ways they're like, well, so I guess that's kind of human nature. But I think it is interesting, to say the least, to think about.
Yeah, and I think well, when you said wake up call, it's certainly, I think it definitely hit the nail on the head with that, but also it certainly put, I think, humans as a whole on almost on blast of like how we can handle certain situations like this, right? Like, I
On
mean,
blast.
yeah, I mean, well, it's kind of like where we were put to the test, and I think one thing we definitely learned is we need to have congruency with our, policymakers, with our people who are actually doing the hard work of research and vaccination and PPE and everything like that. I think there's definitely a lot of pitfalls in regards to that whole situation, but also just in general with skepticism towards the scientific community. I mean, it can almost be like scary sometimes how much there is skepticism.
Yeah.
And of course, healthy skepticism is always warranted. I think there always should be skepticism from the public, because if there wasn't, then we'd just have researchers go out and doing whatever the heck they want to do. And, I think there would be some bad outcomes from that. But I think that it certainly put us humans up to the test.
Yeah, it's almost understatement to say just how much this is, obviously, revealed so much about society in so many ways. And as far as like, skepticism of scientists and stuff like that, I guess you shouldn't change your mind over nothing. You should like look for evidence and stuff like that. But also like once you see evidence, you should maybe consider it and change your mind and stuff. And I don't know. And I think that is one thing that is unfortunate, that like it is tough for like regular people to like scientific papers are like impossible to like go through and stuff like that. And so like I think the issue is like I think that unfortunately you do sort of need these like translators or arbiters to sort of work as intermediaries between lay people, for lack of a better term, and people who do this research firsthand and stuff like that. But like unfortunately you also need that trust there to actually like bridge that gap. So yeah, hopefully that happens. And actually I don't know. One of my things I've been thinking about doing a lot is actually like doing some writing about that, and about like how, about evidence-based living essentially, and skepticism, but also like trusting evidence. And I think one thing I'm kind of interested in is focusing on like, there's a lot of stuff that we take for like there's a lot of stuff that people are skeptical about for in my opinion sometimes seemingly no reason. But then there's a lot of stuff that people take for granted that it's like kind of like, how the hell do we know this? Like, things like that maybe aren't as actually like impactful in our daily lives, but are still very like interesting. Like, for example, like the distance from Earth to the sun. How the hell does it like I don't know. I don't know, but like how do people know this? And so if you were like, it doesn't matter that much technically to most people. Like it's like, okay, yeah, it's whatever, million miles or whatever. But it's like, but how do scientists actually know this? And I think even sort of illuminating the process behind like what do scientists actually do and what are they actually doing, and how are these processes working that they come to these conclusions, even for simple things like that might, kind of encourage people to take more of an interest in how information is learned, and then also, trust in experts when they actually do have information to give, I guess.
Yeah, one of the wildest things to me was always figuring out how scientists how they knew what climates were back like when dinosaurs were around.
That's still a big one. Yeah.
Like you're like, how? And, and obviously the answer is they look at the geological
Right.
rocks, and they can figure out from, whatever was in the rocks at the time, they can figure out, basically what the environment was. But,
but it gets to also that sort of what I was talking about before about foundational research and stuff like that, where it's like it's like you have this conclusion that like, okay, we knew that like 10,000 years ago Earth was like this temperature or whatever, but it's like that is like standing on so much other stuff that's like how you like measure carbon concentrations in rocks or something, and then like that's based on like this method and that method, and it's like, and so it's definitely intimidating to be like, really, how do you know anything,
right.
and that type of thing I think is really interesting. And yeah, so I get some, people who are skeptical of like, how could you possibly know this? And the answer is it's built on this like, big, huge foundation of knowledge that humans have been building for the past, well, I guess for a long time, but many, for modern advances over the past 100 years or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, you have crazy ideas, like even like back when like Socrates and Epictetus used to say, like we don't revolve around the sun doesn't revolve around us, we revolve around the sun, and that stuck like that. They knew that beforehand, but then you have also cases where like physicians used to do lobectomies and just remove sections of the brain, and like we're like, yep, I fixed you. And it's just it's kind of wild
Yeah.
how one could be common practice and then other can be like pushed away so hard, and just how much it changes, and just how much foundational, like you said, from the foundations of everything.
Right. And yeah, I guess that's the question is like, you know, again, like changing your mind when evidence is presented, but also being able to yeah, like see like, oh, is this evidence actually make any sense and stuff like that. And that's been a big part of like my graduate work, or not my work, but like my education is like reading papers and stuff like that and being like, they say that they did this experiment, they said it shows this, but like, does it actually, like, I don't know. And that's kind of a lot of what you do when you end up like, reading this stuff. And yeah, and so it's a matter of what can convince you of something, and I don't know, having an open mind, but also still looking at evidence that is actually shown to you.
Yeah, being flexible with your opinion is super important. I think people kind of associate their opinions with almost their personality sometimes. And if they let go of one thing, maybe it's letting go of their own ego, and that can be certainly difficult. I mean, I don't see it as much. I mean, I see it out here to a certain degree, but I know, even back home we're from and other places, changing someone's mind and where we're originally from is certainly more difficult than changing someone's mind than like in some, like where we are. I mean, obviously it depends on the person.
I don't want to call anyone out. But no,
neither do I. I didn't say any names, but I'm just saying, I think you understand what I'm getting to is like some of these, I'm okay, for record, we're both from upstate New York, and there's a lot of rural locations that have a lot of skepticism that comes to the government and other things, and a lot of the time institutions, yeah, and it never, for some reason, never occurs to me as to why there's so much skepticism right off the bat. There's always it's immediate denial. There's no, okay, here they're presenting us with information, I'm just going to deny it right off the bat before even looking into it or even thinking about it. And I think that might be a bigger problem, but it's certainly not a healthy way to go about forming an opinion or taking in information.
Yeah, it's yeah, I mean, we could do a whole other podcast about this. There's a lot to talk about there, and again, I think going back to like psychology of like people's behaviors and stuff like that, and what they believe and stuff. Yeah.
Well, anyway, I don't want to take too much of your time. I really appreciate you being on here, man, and really answering a lot of important questions that I'm sure a lot of us had or have wanted to know over the past year, and it's certainly been a crazy year. But I did want to kind of close out with one question or one answer, and maybe perhaps you can leave a message of why maybe for anyone that may be a skeptic of taking the vaccine, what maybe a closing remark as to why we should take it, why we should believe the experts, and why it's important for us to move forward as a society to kind of combat this virus that we basically cannot see.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm trying to think of a way to succinctly say this, but these companies put in a lot of research to, I guess maybe the simplest way to kind of get to the heart of it is like these companies made a vaccine against this disease because this disease is bad and people don't want to get it. And I think if you are a person who doesn't want to get this disease, you should totally get vaccinated. Or even if you don't actually, because really, again, with the nature of infectious diseases, you're going to be affecting and maybe unfortunately infecting other people with your behavior. And so I would just say that, all evidence shows that these vaccines are perfectly safe based on what we know. There's no reason to think that they're going to be hazardous to your health in any way, really. And they're shown to be effective. And I would say if you can get one because, it keeps you safe and it keeps people safe. And I guess that's maybe all there is to it. And really, there's nothing to really be afraid of as far as these vaccines or vaccines in general, really. But yeah, especially these ones, I would say. They're just, these companies don't have any sort of they make a product, and this product is something that will help your health. So yeah, I don't know.
Perfect. Well, thank you again so much for being on my podcast, and it's been a blast.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, no worries, and everything you said has been super helpful. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And maybe we can talk again sometime about what we were talking about at the end there about science and evidence and stuff like that.
For sure.
So
all right, well, take
cool.
care.
Thanks, Mike. Have a good one.
You too.